I watched 12 species flunk the Deathworld Navigation Exam. She finished it whistling white heavy checkmark. Examiner Zyrex had administered the Deathworld Navigation certification for 43 years. He had watched Krellian warriors, 7 feet of engineered muscle and reinforced bone, collapse into trembling heaps at the third checkpoint. He had seen Varoshi telepaths, beings capable of reading probability fields, simply sit down in the middle of the ashen corridor and refuse to continue. He had documented Funaki scouts, species who had charted nebulae and mapped black hole event horizons, turn back at the entrance to the Meyerwood sector and file formal complaints about the exam being biologically unreasonable. 43 years. 219 candidates. 12 species represented. 0 completions. The Deathworld Navigation certification existed for one purpose: to qualify navigators for assignment to Class 7 hostile biospheres, planets where the atmosphere tried to eat you. The wildlife had evolved specifically to dismantle anything with a nervous system, and the terrain itself seemed to operate with personal grudges. The course simulated all of it across a 40-kilometer stretch of reconstructed terrain pulled from the 3 most statistically lethal planets in the known galaxy. Nobody finished it. That was essentially the point. You learned where your limits were, you filed your report, and you got assigned somewhere safer. Zyrex had made peace with this reality long ago. Then the Terran application arrived. Her name was Mara Ellison, and she showed up 17 minutes early. Zyrex noted this immediately. Candidates were never early. The pre-exam psychological burden was considered significant enough that most species developed elaborate rituals to avoid arriving before absolutely necessary. The Varoshi had once sent a surrogate to check in, then replaced themselves at the last possible moment. Mara Ellison walked in carrying a battered canvas pack, a thermos of something that smelled aggressively of roasted plant matter, and an expression of mild, cheerful interest, the face of someone visiting a market, not entering a certified death simulation. She was small. Zyrex registered this with quiet professional concern. 163 centimeters. 58 kilograms. The Krellian candidate had outmassed her by a factor of 9, and he had lasted 4 hours before the altitude sickness from the simulated Vethran highland terrain put him on the ground. Navigator Ellison, Zyrex said. I am required to inform you that no candidate has completed this examination. I am further required to inform you that discontinuation is available at any checkpoint and carries no professional penalty. Mara looked up from the thermos she was opening. She had brown eyes and a small scar above her left eyebrow and the sort of resting expression that suggested she had heard worse news before breakfast. Thanks, she said. Good to know. She took a sip of her beverage and looked out at the entrance to the course. Is there a map, or is that part of the deal? Zyrex monitored from the observation station, as he always did. The first sector was the Meyerwood, 3 kilometers of reconstructed Feldhorn jungle, where the flora was mildly toxic, the fauna was aggressively territorial, and the humidity sat at a consistent 91%. Most candidates slowed significantly within the first kilometer. The Funaki had stopped entirely at the boundary, cited sensory overload, and requested a formal review of exam conditions. Mara walked in and immediately did something Zyrex had never observed in 43 years of examination. She looked up. Not in the way candidates usually looked up, the panicked upward scan, searching for aerial threats. She tilted her head back slowly, studying the canopy with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Her lips moved slightly. From the audio feed, Zyrex caught fragments. Oh, that's interesting, the vines are load-bearing for the canopy structure, smart. She navigated the Meyerwood in 2 hours and 14 minutes. The record, previously held by a Varoshi telepath who had cheated by scanning ahead, was 3 hours and 40 minutes. She moved through it like she'd grown up somewhere similar. She had, Zyrex realized, pulling her file. Earth. Specifically, a region called the Pacific Northwest. He looked up the ecological classification. Temperate rainforest. 90+% humidity. Dense canopy. Active wildlife. Regular flooding. She hadn't just grown up somewhere similar. She had grown up in a milder version of this. The Ashen Corridor broke candidates psychologically. It was a 6-kilometer stretch of simulated post-volcanic terrain, unstable ground, poor visibility from particulate matter, temperature swings of 40 degrees within single kilometers, and a carefully maintained atmosphere of low-level toxic gas that induced mild cognitive impairment over time. The idea was to test navigation ability under conditions of genuine physical and mental degradation. The Krelian warrior had made it 1 kilometer before the cognitive effects caused him to become convinced he was somewhere else entirely and begin navigating toward his hallucination. Mara put on a bandana over her nose and mouth, adjusted her pack, and walked in. Zyrex watched her gait change subtly. She slowed her breathing, he noted. Took longer, more deliberate inhales. She was rationing her exposure, he realized. Letting her body process what it took in before taking more. Crude, but effective. It slowed the cognitive degradation significantly. She also, at the 2-kilometer mark, stopped completely. For 40 seconds, she stood still. Zyrex leaned forward, watching the biometric readout. Heart rate, elevated but controlled. Respiration, slow. Brain activity, a pattern he didn't recognize from other candidates. Then she started moving again, slightly adjusted course. Later, reviewing the footage, Zyrex would realize what she'd done. The particulate density had obscured visual landmarks. The cognitive impairment was affecting her memory of her heading. So she had stopped, let her body and mind recalibrate, found a landmark she was certain of, and re-established her bearing from zero. She hadn't pushed through the confusion. She had respected it, worked with it, waited for clarity. 43 years of watching candidates fight the exam, and he had never seen anyone cooperate with it. The Mirewood had been impressive. The Ashen Corridor had been remarkable. The Vethran Highland Crossing was where candidates died, not literally, the simulation prevented that, but where the emergency extraction protocols triggered. Altitude. Cold. Wind that registered force 9 on the Beaufort scale. The terrain was jagged, exposed, and designed to funnel weather patterns into maximum brutality. The Krelian warrior had been extracted from here. So had 6 other candidates, from 4 other species. 2 had triggered extraction voluntarily, a professional embarrassment that several had apparently never recovered from. Mara stopped at the base of the Highland approach and spent 3 minutes simply watching the weather pattern. Then she ate something from her pack. Zyrex noted this. No other candidate had eaten during the exam, most were too stressed, and started climbing. Not straight up. Diagonally. She was reading the wind. She took twice as long as the most direct route would have required. She also expended approximately 40% less energy, because she was never fighting the wind directly, always moving at angles to it, using the terrain features as windbreaks, resting in their lee, timing her exposed crossings to the natural pauses in the gusts. It wasn't elegant. It looked almost accidental, like she was wandering. From above, Zyrex could see the pattern, and it was anything but accidental. And then, 3/4 of the way up the final ridge, she started whistling. Zyrex checked the audio equipment. It was functioning correctly. She was whistling. Some melody he didn't recognize. Tuneless by alien standards, perhaps, but consistent, she kept returning to the same phrase, a simple rising and falling sequence of notes. He pulled up her biometrics. Heart rate, steady. Cortisol, lower than the baseline reading taken before she entered the course. She was calmer on the ridge in force 9 winds than she had been drinking her beverage in the waiting room. Mara Ellison crossed the finish boundary at 6 hours, 42 minutes. The previous record, the furthest anyone had ever gone, was the Varoshi candidate who had made it to the Highland approach before triggering voluntary extraction. Nobody had ever reached the end. Nobody had ever stood where she was standing. She stood there for a moment, looking back at the course. Then she opened her thermos, took a long drink, and looked over at Zyrex. Is there a form, or? Zyrex became aware that he had not moved in some time. He also became aware that he had not blinked in slightly longer than was comfortable. Navigator Ellison, he said, and then found that the sentence he had prepared, the formal certification language he had memorized 43 years ago and never used, had somehow vacated his mind entirely. She waited. Where you come from, he said finally, is it, your planet, is it? Earth? She considered this. Yeah, it can be kind of a lot. The file says you're from a temperate rainforest. I mean, I grew up there. Spent a few years in the Sonoran Desert after that. Did a season in Siberia. She shrugged. Moved around. Zyrex looked at the readout. Then at her. Then at the course behind her, which had, in 43 years, never released anyone. Your cortisol levels decreased during the final ascent. Mara tilted her head. Huh. She seemed to consider this genuinely. The whistling probably helped. Something my dad taught me, if you're getting into your head, put something in your mouth. Gum, a song, whatever. Occupies just enough of your brain to stop the spiral. That is, Zyrex paused. That is not a technique that appears in any certified stress management literature. No, it probably wouldn't. She capped her thermos. So. Certification? He printed it. He had been carrying the template, unfilled, for 43 years. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. Mara Ellison took the certification, folded it twice with the practiced efficiency of someone who had folded many important documents in inconvenient conditions, tucked it into her pack, and headed for the exit. At the door, she paused. Good course, she said. The Ashen Corridor is clever, most people probably fight it instead of waiting it out. Then she left, whistling the same simple melody, and Zyrex stood in his observation station and looked at the empty course and thought about a small blue planet where the rainforests were considered temperate, where people moved through deserts and frozen wastelands recreationally, where a Force 9 ridgeline apparently registered as a reason to whistle. He thought about the 43 years and the 12 species and the 219 candidates. He thought about how she had looked up at the canopy and called the vines interesting. Then examiner Zyrex, 43 years a professional, sat down heavily in his chair and quietly updated his assessment framework.